The Facebook is on, so we're ready to start. So I'll let other folks in as they come. So I just want to welcome everyone to this way of celebrating Laudato Si in just a small way, and special appreciation to Professor Richard Wood for being with us and who is going to share some of his reflections and thoughts. You know, I just wanted to share a couple things about Laudato Si. And the Columban eco-theologian Sean McDonough had said that this document is the single most important piece of Catholic social teaching of the last 100 years and essential to every Catholic's formation for the next 100 years. And I would venture to say that we can certainly include that to other traditions and people around the world. It's not exclusively Catholic. And so our gathering today is just a way of trying to reflect on that, to expand on that. Where do we go from here? And I just wanted to quote two of my favorite pieces from Laudato Si. There are many, many, but two of the ones that I use a great deal are living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or a secondary aspect of our Christian experience. So I really appreciate that and the importance that this document is speaking to us about our connection with the earth and what that requires. And then the second is, and this is a paraphrase, but we're faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis. And integral ecology links care for people and care for God's creation. And to move more deeply into that and what integral ecology means, I think is a great challenge for us. So the Vatican, one of the ways that they're celebrating this anniversary is they just came out with Laudato Si Action Platform. And if you aren't on National Catholic Reporters Earthbeat, I would suggest signing up for it because they have wonderful resources, information, opinions, etc. And so this came out there, and it holds, among other things, 7 principal goals that are linked with the United Nations sustainability goals that they're challenging us all to work on the next 5 to 10 years. And I'll just briefly name the 7. It's response to the cry of the earth, response to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, adoption of simple lifestyles, ecological education, ecological spirituality, and emphasis on community involvement in promoting advocacy and grassroots campaigns. So as we celebrate and reflect on this anniversary, I just thought I'd throw those things out just for your consideration as we move into this event. And the order of our event today is going to be, we'll have an opening prayer, an introduction of Professor Richard Woods, and then he will share with us, and then time for questions and discussion. And those of you that might want to put something in the chat box, a question, you could also do that as he's speaking with us. And then just closing comments, and then Professor Richard Wood will end with a prayer poem reflection that he's chosen. So again, welcome everybody, and just sit back and take notes, appreciate, and enjoy being together, at least in this way. Thank you.
Okay, here's a prayer from Pope Francis, found at the end of Laudato Si, a prayer I love and try to say every morning, a prayer for our earth. So please join me. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you, God, for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Judy. This next part, I'm going to be introducing Professor Richard Wood to our gathering this evening. And unlike what my screen says, I'm Joe Rochelle, not Jonathan. And I'll start by just reflecting that in early March of this year, Pope Francis invited the entire world. He did this on a YouTube forum. He invited the entire world to celebrate this week a special observance of the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. And in his invitation, the Pope pointedly asked, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who will come after us, to children who are growing up? And as part of our response to the Pope's invitation, we are very fortunate and blessed this evening to have with us Professor Richard Wood of the University of New Mexico Department of Sociology. As a man of faith and a sociologist, Professor Wood has extensively researched and published important works on faith-based community organizing, examining the interplay of faith and social activism. He teaches courses in the sociology of religion, social theory, democratic life, and the struggle for justice in America. Two of his published books, Faith in Action, and the more recent, A Shared Future, Faith-Based Organizing for Racial Equity and Ethical Democracy. Both of these books have been widely recognized as important contributions to the field of sociology and religion. Professor Wood has served as director of the UNM Religious Studies program, where he led a series of forums, public forums entitled Nexus, Religion and the Public University. And these forums dealt with emerging ethical and environmental issues in American society. And it was followed by a clergy-faculty dialogue. He has worked with the Archdiocese to fund the endowed chair for Catholic Studies at UNM. He's also served as a pro bono national advisor to the Bishops' Committee overseeing the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, the major anti-poverty and community organizing arm of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He's a member of the governing board of the Dominican Ecclesial Institute, or DEI, and in this role he has led 4 public series on Pope Francis's encyclicals, Joy of the Gospel and Laudato Si. Professor Wood worships with the immigrant community at Holy Ghost Catholic Church in Albuquerque and serves on the governing board of Faith in Action, the largest national faith-based community organizing network. I've not met Professor Wood personally, but after reviewing his curriculum vitae, I can say that he is a very diligent and careful researcher. He asks important questions. He is a man of faith, and he's very busy. So we are very fortunate to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wood.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Sister Joan and everybody. Joe, that was a very generous introduction. I appreciate it.
Sure.
There's a whole bunch of people on this call. They're just sitting here saying, nah, it's just Rich. And it is indeed just Rich. It's great to be here with you all. I'm not going to talk about my research, and I'm not going to talk that much about Laudato Si specifically. Instead, I'm going to try to step back and talk with you for about 20 minutes about how I read this moment in the signs of the times, what I think Francis is doing in his writing. And I built this off of some questions that some of you submitted ahead of time that I think Sister Joan is going to put up on screen in a minute here. Framed around, but first St. Francis and his work on the margins of the church to address economic inequity and care for people scorned by society. There you go. And how might we follow St. Francis's example in these times? A question about transformative resilience and what the future might be calling us into. And a question about some new paradigms and how we can move away from old structures that are destroying the earth. And I thought those were such great kind of opening questions. I built this presentation out of those in dialogue with Pope Francis and some other folks I'm going to mention at the very end. Okay, Joan, I think you can take those down now. So I want to start just by asking folks to, as we think about both St. Francis and Pope Francis, let's not forget about that other great statement from Pope Francis, the joy of the gospel. And both St. Francis and Pope Francis really center what they're doing in the joy of living in God's love. And Pope Francis speaks of living the daily encounter with the Spirit of life, with that intimate flow of relationship between Creator, Christ, and the Holy Spirit and ourselves. And that out of that encounter comes this deep joy of the gospel. And I think I want to start by saying that one thing we can do now, really literally now every day, is try to assure that we're living within that intimate flow, cultivating some kind of spiritual practice individually, and hopefully pretty soon again communally, that provides some bedrock joy in our lives and relationships, because we know we're loved. We know we're sinners in the arms of a loving and forgiving God. We know that we're intimately embraced by the one that the theologian Elizabeth Johnson calls she who is. I think it's that kind of encounter, really lived intimately and mystically, that Jesus and Francis and Clare all lived, and that I think Pope Francis is calling us to today. And in starting with that note about joy and living in joy, please don't get me wrong. I'm not speaking against a kind of righteous anger at the state of our climate, at the state of our political leadership in this country. Anger, too, I think, is a holy emotion when it's directed at injustice. But I also think it will burn us out if we live in anger too closely and too constantly. And Francis, out of that joyful encounter, calls us to be what he calls missionary disciples, or what we might call prophets in our own world, in a world that's in crisis. Climate change and inequality, authoritarianism, as we're seeing it around the world today and in this country, and now the pandemic. Maybe everybody on this call sees ourselves as somehow engaged in those struggles in one way or another. And maybe especially about climate change and sustainability. But I just want to recognize that that struggle is a long one, it's a hard one, and change comes so slowly, if it comes at all. And our spirits grow weary at times. So I wanted to step back from the letter and from the moment and reflect on you about how we can sustain ourselves and our spirits, even as we work for sustainability, for social justice, and for deeper democracy in the world today. And in doing that, maybe we can learn something from the social prophets of ancient Israel. That's Amos and Habakkuk and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah. We tend to think of those prophets as railing angrily against injustice all the time. And they did that. But the Jewish scripture scholar, Abraham Heschel, in his classic work titled The Prophets, writes that though the ancient prophets of Israel burn with anger at injustice, he says anger is not the prophet's kind of central emotional experience. Their experience is at least equally rooted in God's delight and in their own delight with God. And that delight sort of complements and flows alongside their anger all the time. And instead, the prophet's really central emotional experience It's what Heschel writes about as each prophet's fusion with the emotional life of God. The prophets live in this kind of intimate communion with God that Heschel called the pathos of God, and that I think Francis writes about as that encounter with God. And for Heschel, the pathos of God is rooted centrally in love for creation and love for humanity. It's a kind of overarching and undergirding love that transcends all failure and really transcends and motivates the anger of the prophets. And that love endures as a kind of everlasting promise to the people of Israel, to the Jews, and in the Christian view, to the church as well. And I think that is where Pope Francis strives to lead each of us through this invocation of a culture of encounter, to encounter that God, her spirit, and with one another in that spirit of the ancient prophets of Israel. So in the present, how might we each strive to live within that kind of encounter? I think we live that way by also living into the future, and this question about what is the future calling us into. I do think that beyond the immediate public health issues we face, that is probably the most fundamental question we face as a society, and really the central question facing all societies everywhere in the world in this time of crisis. And I do think that the great seclusion, this time of isolation we're living through now, allows us to ask some new questions, to reflect on the way ahead as we strive to help society face that question creatively. But I do want to say I'm not optimistic. I think habits are powerful in our lives, and the most likely future is probably that society goes back to its old ways. So I want to speak more for hope than for some kind of easy optimism. Here's how I would describe the difference. Optimism assumes that things will get better. Hope yearns for things to get better. Both can lead one to work hard for a better future, but optimism assumes too much. It assumes too much good in the world. And because it assumes too much good, it often ends in a kind of grim bitterness of disappointment. One kind of optimism would have us kind of sit back passively and think that somehow the powers that be will be jolted to their senses and make wiser choices. I doubt many of us are tempted to that. But I think a more common kind of optimism sort of a little self-righteously thinks that we have the right views, the right analysis, and that surely this time around, if we only work hard enough and sacrifice ourselves enough, our reason will prevail and better people will get elected, say, in November. But notice, it's our reason that will prevail and get better people elected. I actually think both kinds of optimism fail the test of experience over many years of different kinds of governments and various crises in this country. What I think that experience tells us is this: as a culture, we are so deeply addicted to cheap carbon, to high profits, and to intense consumption that any leaders we elect are unlikely to place cheap carbon, high profits, and intense consumption at risk. Any leaders we elect are unlikely to place those things at risk. So real change is going to require something different than just different leaders. And immediate optimism is likely to lead us to the kind of grim bitterness of disappointment I described earlier. In contrast, hope assumes very little. Instead, hope yearns passionately and can preserve that yearning because it is grounded in something beyond the self, something beyond politics. For the ancient prophets and for Pope Francis, real hope only emerges from the kind of encounter I described earlier, a graced relationship to God that allows us to be realistic about our situation as judged from the heart of God. That's what the prophets did. They didn't sort of read the signs of the time from their own point of view. They read the signs of the times and they judged reality from the viewpoint and from the heart of God. Likewise, Francis sees God's judgment on the contemporary world as profoundly linking, as Sister Joan described, profoundly linking our twin crises of ecological destruction and economic inequality. Two sides of a kind of lust for profits and power that drives the contemporary world. That kind of lust erodes society from within because ultimately both lust, both profits and power exploit society and exploit creation without mercy. To the extent we participate in that kind of exploitation, that lust erodes us from within, because ultimately profits and power are illusory and meaningless as seen from the viewpoint of God, of history. From God's viewpoint, economics and politics are intended to support human thriving, support human communities, and the ecological wholeness of creation, as we would say now, that is, support our common home. Instead of that, our economics and politics today have come to exploit human beings, distort human communities, and undermine whole ecological systems, as Laudato Si lays out so beautifully. That's how I understand Francis's diagnosis of our ills today, his reading of the signs of the times. If that's a good diagnosis, and I think it is, what might transformative resilience, as one of you phrased it, look like? That is, what is the future calling us into? Or in Francis's terms, what are we called to become by the one with whom we dwell in the mystery of encounter with those we love, with this vast beauty of nature, and hopefully soon again in the Eucharist or whatever form of communion your own spiritual community practices? Let me describe where I see God's hand at work in this moment, the kind of transformative resilience to which I think we might be invited. At the core of our crisis is an entire economic system in which we measure value and equality of life according to how much we produce and how much we spend. Literally, that is what GDP measures, how much we produce and therefore spend. That fundamental measure now colonizes our culture and how we're governed. That's really what neoliberalism is, transferring economic standards of value over into realms of life like culture and politics where those measures don't belong. Neoliberalism and the idealization of the market has so eroded American culture that we could elect someone like our current president. It is what has so eroded American democracy that he can govern us as he has, and frankly, still face a plausible chance for re-election this November. As a result, the fundamental ill that runs in deep in contemporary culture is the idolatry of productivity and profit, power and consumption over all else. Call it the P3C society: productivity, profit, power, and consumption above all. And it penetrates all parts of our culture. It affects all of us. Left and right want to consume different things, consume different kinds of experiences, but all want to consume more. In wanting to consume more, Democrats and Republicans and Greens and Libertarians alike often work harder, produce more, and so draw down more resources. Hope will be born to the extent we're honest about that diagnosis and see it not through a partisan lens, but through the eyes of God. Yes, I know. In partisan terms, certainly some candidates are better than others, some policies more grounded in better science, some laws and some leaders more fair to the vulnerable and marginalized, and thus better for sure than what we have. We can and should work hard to assure that such leaders are elected and that such laws govern us. Indeed, we should use our money and our passion to help make sure of that this November. But I want to be clear. Our deliverance will not come from the next election, no matter who is elected. Indeed, our deliverance will not come from partisan politics at all in the short term. All of us, including the most progressive candidates out there, are beholden to a society that idolizes productivity, profit, power, and consumption. Even the progressives are mostly talking about redistribution, maybe redistribution of money or of access to healthcare or of opportunity to play in this society. But what's the game of society? It's that P3C game. For we can only redistribute what we produce. So even progressive policies will inevitably produce trade-offs, and even progressive leaders will be unable to consistently choose sustainability and racial equity and economic justice if they want to be reelected. And as we have all seen, they do want to be reelected, so they will inevitably disappoint us. That is not a reason not to support progressives. We must especially support progressive policies on carbon taxation, on alternative energy, on strong environmental protection, and an end to environmental racism and all the rest. But our deepest hope, our ultimate allegiance, must not rest in those things. For even the champions of such policies like us are partly beholden to that idolatry of the day, or at least live in a world defined by that idolatry. In that sense, we are indeed all sinners. We need to engage passionately in that world, fight the good fight in the name of social justice and environmental sustainability, and yes, ask for forgiveness for the ways we are compromised by the reality we live in. But we really must ground our ultimate hope elsewhere. Where might that be that can sustain our deep hope? Of course, the obvious answer is to ground it in God and her spirit moving in the world. But frankly, I'd like a little more immediate grounding as well. Where might that more immediate grounding lie? Here's my candidate. I'm going to talk a little economics and sociology with you. Please bear with me. Ultimately, I'll come back to the spirit. Beyond our current reality defined by the P3C economy, can we imagine, just imagine with me for a moment, what I'd like to call an economy of time? The coronavirus pandemic and its social isolation, what I like to call that great seclusion, have given some sectors of society, including me, the opportunity to savor a new quality of time flow in our lives. I know that opportunity is a product of privilege. For the less privileged, the pandemic has offered only illness and mourning and the unfocused fear born of isolation and inept public leadership. Or at best offered exhaustingly busy days pressed between childcare and elder care and dangerous work. But if we're privileged to have a little more time, let's use it for the wider good. Take advantage of that new time flow to read the signs of the times and what I'd call the P3C end times and what might lie beyond it. Here's my hope: that we gradually construct an economy of time beyond the pandemic. In such an economy, our value and our quality of life would be measured not by gross domestic product, not by profit and consumption, but by the total of everyone's free time, the time people, including the most disadvantaged, can commit not to the necessary labor that makes life in the world possible, but to the kinds of pursuits we choose in spiritual freedom. Pursuits we see as good in themselves, like building a carbon-free future. Here's why that matters. In our current economy, new profits and new wages have to get invested either in new productivity or in new consumption. That's the way the economy works. In investing in new productivity and new consumption, it expands our use of carbon and other resources. In contrast, in an economy of time, new profits and new wages could be invested in increasing the total free time in our society, and thus invested in pursuits and practices inherently valuable in themselves. Practices like communing with the natural world, practices of spiritual discipline, of building a world not poisoned by our waste, nor threatened by our carbon dumping into our common home. Of course, such a vision raises all kinds of questions. What kinds of policies would undergird such an economy of time? How might we identify politicians who would commit to a long-range project of building such an economy brick by brick? How might we elect them and hold them accountable to that vision? Most fundamentally, how do we sustain ourselves and the hope for an economy of time, living as we do in a P3C world? That is, how do we live now in light of such a hope? I don't have answers to all those questions. There lies a lot of future shared work. But I think somewhere in such a vision lies the kind of future for which Francis hopes, maybe all of us hope, a vision beyond our current world of economic injustice and ecological exploitation. A future in which economics and politics support our communities and our common home. if we can find ways to live with such a vision and an ongoing encounter with God and the Spirit, it might give us the spiritual insight and the democratic energy that would allow us to gradually work to transform the world around us. That's where I find hope in the world today, in communion with all of you, with Francis, with creation, and with she who is. So that's what I'd offer as food for thought for us, as a kind of reflection on the 3 questions that you all submitted. And in wrapping up, I do want to ask Joan to put up some of the things I drew on in reflecting on all that. That Abraham Heschel book, a book by a guy named Martin Hogland, who's a radical secularist and opposes everything that some of us, maybe all of us, believe in the way of spirituality and faith, but it's also a brilliant piece on the nature of work to change the world today. So thanks for bearing with me. It's delightful to be here with you all. Let's talk.
So, Richard, thank you so much for that very powerful presentation with so much to not just reflect on, but to delve into practicality, how we can move into this. And I'm reminded of a Guatemalan artist, weaver, that I met many years ago. And in sharing their story, they said, it was only after the conquest that we ended up in a different kind of worldview or reality. Before then, we spent 1/3 of our lives working to provide food and what we needed to live. The other part of our lives was spent with our arts, culture, community, and our spiritual rituals and practices. And I've always remembered that, thinking what a balanced life that was and how we've gone so far from that. And for many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters or others, that this sort of Western kind of a way of thinking that we've evolved into right now has pressured them so much to move so beyond who they know themselves to be. So I was thinking of that when you talked of this economy of time. So thank you very much for that. That's a lot to ponder. So I'd like to just open this up to other to questions or reflections people might have, things that they'd like to pursue more.
And please, I do welcome questions, but also reflections of your own, and also silence. I tell my graduate students, I am preternaturally comfortable with silence, and I figure it means folks are just digesting and reflecting. So if we sit here in silence together, all the better. Okay.
I'd just like to say rah, rah, as far as getting action and contemplation in balance, because I don't think we can sustain anything worthwhile without being in track or as in track as we can get with God's will. So you really need both of them.
Yeah. So that Martin Hogland that I mentioned, this book called This Life, the Radical Secularist, part of the way he's brilliant is that he's a hardliner on the ways that religion can pull people out of this world, out of this life, withdraw us from the democratic struggle, the struggle for a better future, and become a distraction, right? Marx's religion is the opiate of the people. And you know, I take that seriously. But Judy, I think you're exactly right. That somewhere the balance of action and contemplation lies the ability to dedicate ourselves deeply and radically to this worldly change, while also staying emotionally and spiritually grounded enough to do that for the long term. Hogland would say that's garbage. The more struggle, the better. Just live this life as it is. But I think he's wrong about that. I think it is a balance of contemplation and action in the world.
have a question. Since I was not able to arrive until the very end, is there any chance this was recorded?
I think it is, Joan.
Yeah, it's being recorded. It's actually live streaming on Facebook, and we're recording it, and that'll be put up on our website as well, so it can be shared out. And so grateful that, Richard, you're open to that, because this is a very good presentation, important to share with others.
Thank you.
Richard, this is Joe Rochelle. I was really, in many ways, blown away by what you had to say, and was particularly intrigued with your discussion of the prophets, because so often I do view the prophets as traveling on anger, and seeing that as the source of their sort of energy, the sort of personification of the righteousness of God. And I really found very lovely your discussion about how there was something anterior to that, and that they were passionate, that they started with a passionate relationship with God, a passionate relationship of love, and then moved from that to sort of the what is, which would naturally provoke anger. And I just want to thank you for that, because it's a whole different way of looking at the prophets.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. If you bear with me for just a second, I do want to say a bit about anger, because I think we in American culture, writ broadly, I don't think this is just the white middle class. I think it's deep in most streams of American culture, are really uncomfortable with anger, and have interpreted the Gospels as a call to not be angry. I think a lot of strands of spirituality, both Christian and Buddhist and other, are often interpreted as this, we're supposed to shed anger. There's this marvelous book that I learned of through my research on faith-based organizing. One of the organizers I have gotten to know very well did a training once, that drew on this beautiful book written by a Mexican Jesuit, Carlos Bravo, called Jesus, Hombre en Conflicto, Jesus, Man of Conflict.
Oh.
And the core of it, it's as many of you know, Gospel of Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. And he does this deep analysis of the whole narrative structure of the Gospel of Mark, and argues the whole action of the life of Jesus as recounted in Mark turns on 4 moments of deep, passionate anger of Jesus, where he doesn't get, he's gentle with the common folk all the time. Where he gets angry, it's always with people in authority, either religious authority or political authority, failing to use their authority for the good of all, right? So he doesn't, when we read the gospel, we can say, and then Jesus turned over the tables at the temple, and then he called them whitened sepulchres. And Bravo says, no, that's not what Jesus called them. He called them whitened sepulchres, right? It's this anger of Jesus, but it's rooted in his love for the Anolim around him, the little ones, and his encounter with God, right? So that's been an important lesson in my life, that there are moments when anger is the right emotion. It's the righteous emotion. It's maybe the holy emotion. And frankly, I do think the moment we're living in is one with a lot of space for a lot of anger. But if that anger isn't grounded and backed up by a deep love for others, then does our world need more people fuming on social media because they're angry from the other side, right? We got to learn how to channel our anger in constructive and loving ways, I think.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Juan I'm actually chiming in from El Rito, New Mexico.
Hey, Juan.
Hi, Rich. I want to thank you for your thought-provoking remarks. And unfortunately, I, like you, am not optimistic about the immediate future in this country. I think this current situation, the pandemic, has kind of laid bare the sins, if you will, of this country's founders, i.e. the genocide and marginalization of indigenous peoples here, the enslavement of others for generations, and I could go on, but basically a lot of populations, as we know, are taking this pandemic very hard. And again, I think that's just the results of the past history. On the other hand, I do have hope based on history that during moments of big social disruption is also the opportunity for the most change to occur in a society. And I'm wondering if maybe through your knowledge, you could share with us some background or history of how that has happened and what happens to actually be able to transform a society when there's major social disruption like we're having right now.
Thanks, Juan. It's great to see you. I don't want to say too much because I've spoken a long time, but the one insight I would offer actually came from one of my mentors at Berkeley ages ago. What's become a really classic article in sociology by Anne Swidler. What she does is tries to read history, and when do you get moments of real effervescence that sort of shifts the course of society in a substantial way. And in particular, when does culture, things like religious teaching, things like the voice of someone like Francis, or your all's work, right? Your all's involvement in culture and politics to try to change the way New Mexicans think about energy. And she says, most of the time, that cultural stuff is sort of fluff on the surface that just can't change the deep interests of power and economics that drive history. But she says where you get moments of redefining the future, it's what she calls unsettled times. And I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I think what the pandemic and the economic crisis we're living through right now, it's like the definition of an unsettled time. Nobody knows what the future holds. Everybody's looking around for how we can build a future that's going to be different than our present or the past that led us here. And so I think the insight out of that is we're exactly in the kind of moment as society, despite when I say I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful partly because I do think we're living in a deeply unsettled time where if we can generate the leadership and the vision built around something like what Francis is trying to tell us, then I think we do have a shot at shifting the course of our history in a direction, it's going to be built out of what's come before, but it's going to be built on all that refracted through some new ideas. And I think Francis is offering us, and others are offering us, exactly the kinds of ideas that could shift us in that kind of a direction towards an economy that thinks about the world differently, thinks about the role of the economy in a way that supports human communities in a new way.
Can I ask some questions?
Hi, Anne.
Okay, so this idea of the economy of time, is that your idea? Is that your expression, Rich?
No, that comes out of that Martin Hoagland book.
Oh, really?
Life, yeah.
Yeah. I wondered if you thought about other kinds of economies. I mean, that's an interesting one. Where do we set our priorities in terms of time?
Yeah. There are probably a whole other kinds of economies one could think about. In a minute, I'll describe why he talks about an economy of time. But let's talk about your questions first.
Well, I just appreciated. I mean, you sounded like a preacher today. I appreciated all the stuff on the prophets and using the language of idolatry, which I think we need to bring back. And your free PC is a pretty good summary of the idolatry of the time, or of our current age. I just think it's interesting to help us think about what's the fundamental value. Is it free market economics,
or not. And lots of people will always come down to saying, oh no, it's the time I spent with my grandchildren or whatever, that is so important to them. I think time is an interesting idea.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Anyway, go ahead, you talk.
Okay, so let me just briefly describe what Hagelin does in this book. So then let me make it interesting by telling you this. I describe the book this way. It is simultaneously, I think, a brilliant and it's not an easy read. It's a brilliant, sophisticated laying out of everything I feel like I've committed my life to and lived for in the way of social justice and a struggle in this world for what I would think of as a Christian as the kingdom of God, the reign of God. And at the same time, it's a sophisticated and brilliant rejection of everything I've lived my life for, because he's a radical secular. He thinks all religion is garbage, and he lays that out systematically. So if you decide to read it, just know that's what you're getting into. And that's why it's titled This Life, because he misdefines religion as being all about the next world and the afterlife and all that. The reason he calls it an economy of time is he thinks we've misunderstood the nature of capitalism. And at the very core of capitalism is not an exploitation of labor, but an exploitation of time. And so he's reframing it based on that. And I just found that a very, very powerful way to think about it. Because ultimately, when we choose what work we do, when we choose how we build our economy, what we're doing is allocating people's time to one thing versus another. And if we can think about differently, and frankly, this is what the monasteries did that kept civilization alive in Europe, right? It was building life around a different sense of time. And maybe that's part of what we need to do. I do think we have something to learn from the Native communities about that, from agrarian and Hispanic communities about that. In saying that, I do want to come back to Sister Joan, what you said at the opening. I don't know enough about Guatemala before the conquest to know. So I'm not countering what your friend told you. But I do think we tend to idealize those cultures that were pre-industrial, at least most of them, maybe not indigenous Guatemala. The vast majority of people lived very, very difficult lives and worked a hell of a lot of the time in very difficult exploitative conditions of rulers with a lot of power. I still think Native communities and other rural communities have much to teach us about our understanding of time, but I think we do them respect by understanding that they weren't idyllic societies either. Typically, they had their own challenges as well, even as we learn from them.
I probably found, is somebody else talking? Because I'll let them.
Go ahead.
Okay. I probably sound very naive, but I appreciate this talk because it's bringing together so clearly the whole concept of the universal Christ and how it's not contemplation and action. It's all one. Because if you see God in everyone and in everything, as the universal Christ idea does, then you have to be involved in protecting and helping everything to thrive, people and that. And you would not sit back and be in la la land and away from reality. So I really think that idea of the universal Christ is a very important idea for these times. I just wanted to put that out there.
Thanks, Judy.
Uh-huh.
I have a comment. I think the conditions we're experiencing now, I hope, are present what might be a unique opportunity to raise these ideas about how our society and our economy might be operated differently on the basis of different values. And I say that because this disruption that we're experiencing is, as I understand it, maybe it was similar in 1918 during that great flu pandemic. But at least in modern times, it's unprecedented in that the disruption has been brought about not because of warfare or some other sort of external factor, but it was occasioned in order to protect people, in order to safeguard the public, safeguard all of us. And so I guess what I'm getting at is it's the first time that public health has been used as the to supersede everything, every other consideration, every economic consideration, every political, it's that has become the priority. How do we protect public health? And I think that's remarkable that it actually happened. And I suppose you could say, well, it's driven by fear and selfishness, because of course no one wants to get sick and no one wants to die. But it seems to me there's more to it than that. That this didn't happen. It's hard to imagine that this wouldn't have happened given the nature of the pandemic. But I still think it's remarkable that the protection of public health has emerged as the priority concern in the world today. And because it affects everybody. The problem, of course, has been that up to now, with all of the other threats in the world to human health or environmental health, as those threats have been isolated. Particular wars in particular regions, environmental catastrophes that are isolated, more events, that kind of thing. And it hasn't had this world scope that this pandemic does. But as we all know, the kinds of threats we're facing in the way of climate change and loss of biodiversity and nuclear war, those are universal threats that will affect everybody. And I think there is an opportunity here. I don't know how you make the translation to extend this awareness that people have now of this universal threat that everyone is facing, to extend that awareness to these other issues that are out there that we're all facing and that we're trying to grapple with and figure out how to construct a society and an economy that will, in fact, pay attention to those. So and I'd like to offer that as I've heard, and I imagine you all have heard, this is something that can't wait. this is, there is such a small window of opportunity left for addressing these threats to public health, to universal well-being, and that somehow we have to figure out how we can take this awareness that is out there now, fractured though it is, but still widely shared, and initiate this this discussion about, you know, this is how we have to react to these other threats that we're facing. We have to put public health first. We have to put public safety. We have to put the health and safety of the world and of the people first. And the pandemic shows us why that's the case. So I just wanted to throw out that idea. I am hopeful that, you know, that this could, I hate to say, use the word catalyst, because it seems like there's been so many potential catalysts that have never really borne fruit, but it seems like this could be one, and the one that we need.
I think that's right. And, I think the key thing is that we not sit and wait for that to happen, but do what we can to build in this moment. And I think that means working through institutions, you know, whether working through your local parish, your local church, your synagogue, your mosque, your local small town, your friendship networks. You know, how can we begin to multiply some commitment, some awareness of this? How can we use elections, right? Again, not because elections are the answer, but because elections are a tool for multiplying this in front of a lot of people. There's an awful lot of good work being done that we can contribute to help catalyze that happening. Others?
So I'm aware that we've gone over an hour here, and I know some people have other things, probably other commitments. So I just, I want to mention a couple things. First of all, Richard, this has just been so very good. And if folks would like to have, you know, a follow-up of some sort with the topic or more discussion, or how we might, you know, make this as a reality, how we might join together in whatever those institutions or anything, whatever thoughts, just email me. And Anna, my PL, we'd be glad to, if Richard or others, it might even be interesting to have a conversation, Richard, with you and Larry Rasmussen, who is one of our advisors, who is Creative Ideas is an excellent too. We need to find a woman to balance it all out. But
I've got one for you. Lisa Gerber at UNM is great on ecological.
Yes. Okay, well, email me if you have thoughts, and we can always pursue a deeper conversations around this. So, Richard, again, I just want to thank you so much, and everybody for joining.
Well,
and
thank you all. It's delightful to spend a little time with you, and thanks for being part of it.
And the other thing I just wanted to mention before, Richard, you leave us with a poem reflection that you would like to share, is that if anybody is interested in public policy advocacy, Interfaith Power and Light, we have a little group of people that meets regularly on some of these kind of topics and issues that are local, but also federal. And just let me know if you'd like to be part of that. We're meeting via Zoom now, so it can be anywhere, anybody, anytime. Well, not anytime, but we do have a set time. Anywhere where you are, you can join in. So that would be wonderful. And then also I will be sending out a little note with another upcoming event that Richard was noting might be of interest. I'll send that out after we finish. And also the resources that you mentioned, I'll send those in an email as well. So if people didn't catch that slide. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone very much. And we would love a closing reflection.
Okay, I don't have a reflection, but I've got two poems to share. And if folks, the second poem's a little long, so folks need to jump off the call. No offense at all. The first one was by Kitty O'Meara, written for the COVID pandemic. And the people stayed home and read books and listened, rested and exercised and made art and played games and learned new ways of being, and they were still. And they listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced. Some met their shadows, and the people began to think differently, and the people healed. And in the absence of people living in ignorant, dangerous, mindless, and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger passed, and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. Again, Kitty O'Meara. And the second one is titled Lockdown in Wuhan. It's written by a Capuchin Franciscan brother, Richard Hendrick. Yes, there is fear. Yes, there is isolation. Yes, there is panic buying. Yes, there is sickness. Yes, there is even death. But they say that in Wuhan, after so many years of noise, you can hear the birds again. They say that after just a few weeks of quiet, the sky is no longer thick with fumes, but blue and gray and clear. They say that in the streets of Assisi, people are singing to each other across the empty squares, keeping their windows open so that those who are alone may hear the sounds of family around them. They say that at a hotel in the west of Ireland is offering free meals and delivery to the housebound. Today, a young woman I know is busy spreading flyers with her number through the neighborhood so that the elders may have someone to call on. Today, churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples are preparing to welcome and shelter the homeless, the sick, and the weary. All over the world, people are slowing down and reflecting. All over the world, people are looking at their neighbors in a new way. All over the world, people are waking up to a new reality, to how big we really are, to how little control we really have, to what really matters, and to love. So we pray and we remember that yes, there is fear, but there does not have to be hate. Yes, there is isolation, but there does not have to be loneliness. Yes, there is panic buying, but there does not have to be meanness. Yes, there is sickness, but there does not have to be a disease of the soul. And yes, there is even death, but there can always be a rebirth of love. Wake to the choices you make as to how to live now. Today, breathe. Listen behind the factory noises of your panic. The birds are singing again. The sky is clearing. Spring is coming, and we are always encompassed by love. Open the windows of your soul, and though you may not be able to touch across the empty square, sing, just sing. Again, Richard Hendrick, Capuchin Franciscan brother. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you so much again, Richard. Also, thanks Judy and Joe and Patrick for helping organize this as well. So thank you all. Blessings, blessings to everyone.
Thank you.
Great to see you all.
Yes.
And thank you, Interfaith Faith and Power. It's great work you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes.
you, Rich.
Good night.
And Sister
Good day.
Joan, you could be that woman. You are that woman in our site with you and Larry.
That's right.
You
That's
could-
I know, Joan. Joan, I don't think we have to look very far.
Uh-huh.
And Joan, all you have to do is look in the mirror, and there she is.
That's right.
Indeed.
Blessings.